Hello, I'm Ed Krumpe. I'm a retired professor from the College of Natural Resources. I came to the University of Idaho in 1979 to teach the wilderness management course. And that first season I was here, because I had been a park superintendent and had been a carpenter before that, I was tasked with going in and looking at this facility. They called it Taylor Ranch, which had 64 acres that had been homesteaded by Jess Taylor, who was a famous outfitter. And then later it became a site for research for Morris Honacher's, the first in the world to radio collar cougars. And so for 27 years there were cougars radio collared in there. But they flew me in, and of course, Taylor Ranch is what everyone called it. And I was expecting a ranch. And it's not. It's 64 acres on Big Creek, a beautiful creek. It's the primary tributary to the Middle Fork, 7 miles up from the Middle Fork of the Salmon. And there were several log cabins, some historic. There were a couple newer structures. Things weren't in very good repair. And there were seasonal interns that would work on science projects in there. But the outfitter, they retained an outfitter that actually took care, and it was a caretaker of the place, in exchange for hunting privileges, and then the students would come and go. But it was in rough condition. And so, when I first saw it, I've got to tell you, my first surprise was this isn't a ranch. It's in a steep canyon river valley. But there's something special about that piece of landscape. I guess I call it a sense of place. When you step out of the plane, or even if you hike in and cross the bridge, and you look around, there's just, it's like there's everything you'd need to survive there. You have a view to the north of the grass-covered benches. There's three levels of benches where the elk and bighorn sheep and deer come in the winter. When there's snow everywhere else, they can still browse there. We've counted up to 64 at a time of elk, bighorn, and deer on those slopes. The stream is a primary tributary. There's salmon that run up it. There's lots of cutthroat and bull trout. And then there are two small streams. A very small stream, Pioneer Creek, comes right through the complex where some of the cabins are. And at the west end of the property is Rush Creek, and that crosses our property. And that's a fair-sized stream. And there's a lot of anadromous fish go up it. And so you have this combination of open spaces, forest to the south, because that's north-facing, and then two streams plus the major creek, and it's wide open. You get the sun in the summer. It's just a special place, and you look at it, and before long you start hiking around, and pretty soon you find signs that someone else has been here. Like you go downstream less than a mile, and there's these depressions in the ground, which people used to speculate, was that where trees fell over and that was a root ball, or was that miners scratching holes or something? Well, it was pit houses. We called them sheep eater Indians, but they were prior to that. Ancient houses that finally was excavated. So one of the archaeologists from the University of Idaho, Dr. Frank Leonhardt, came in, had a grant from the National Geographic Society, and started to dig those. And those were dug into the ground, and then there would be dark colored circular holes along each side where they made like Quonset huts, and covered that with bark and brush and stuff. And there'd be a fire pit in one end always. And these are, the excavation for the archaeologists was quite deep. But being sunken in like that, they could survive that super hot summer, but they could also survive in the winter because they had some of the temperature from the ground to help protect them. And then there's bones and things excavated in the fire pits. But you look around, and closer to the Taylor Ranch, there's some nice flat spots by the stream to camp on. And you just kind of look around, and there's everything you need. There's some shade, there's some open, There's the water. There's places to graze if you had stock or horses. It's just a special place, and people just. I've noticed for years, because I've been going in since 1979, that people come and they'll walk around and they're quiet. They just look around and they say, "Holy cow! This is a huge valley." I mean, that's the benches across the stream rise almost 2,000 feet. So there's just something special. Old Dave Lewis that homesteaded it picked a great spot. And then after that, Jess Taylor had a great spot, and Morris Hohenacher saw the value of it. And we're just blessed that the university at the time was willing to put up about $100,000 to eventually buy it, which was a steal. So yeah, that's my first impressions, but I still feel that it's a special place. You have a sense of place, and many others have mentioned the same thing.
Sounds like the mountain sheep eaters also knew it was a great spot, and perhaps.
Well, the archaeologists showed us a little better than perhaps at Taylor, because it's just downstream a little bit, that it was flat, had the stream, there was forage, places to fish, and we actually found some of these. At first, they were stones that had a little bit of an indentation. Well, those were net anchors for getting salmon, and the primary bones in the fire pits were salmon and actually bighorn sheep, not hardly any elk. But if you look at it, what an advantage of that spot was that there was a narrow approach on either end of this flat area, and just one person on each end could have protected that, stood guard. So easy to protect and defend. And so that's something we don't think about for choosing a campsite. But everything else that we like in a campsite, availability of firewood, flat spot, access to water, some shade, some sun, some forage, everything else I'm sure was the same close to 3,000 years ago when that was occupied. So it's pretty amazing. I should mention.
Fantastic. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, well, there's actually a third stream, because on the property we had water rights for 3 streams, and across Big Creek from where the facilities are, there's Cliff Creek, which is a steep creek that comes down out of the Lambing Cliffs, and so there's an area that's almost like a cirque that's very steep and rocky and inaccessible, and bighorn sheep will only lamb on those cliffs that are just totally inaccessible. So Cliff Creek comes tumbling down there too. So we actually had 3 streams. So that's a pretty special spot. You tell a realtor, I want a place in the mountains that has flat and open and a major stream and 3 minor streams and whatever. That's it has a lot of neat attributes.
That's amazing. I have a friend who's a PhD in water resources, and I think she's studying Pioneer Creek or another one of those creeks around there. Could even be Cliff, but she's looking at springs specifically. That was fantastic, Ed. You actually answered 3 of my questions.
Oh.
I was going to ask you to describe the geography around Taylor to somebody who's never been, but you basically did that. And then you also kind of described the kind of deeper historical scene area with the sheep eater. So that was really fantastic.
You know, I'd like to mention though the more modern history. Different people came through and stayed at that after Dave Lewis. Dave Lewis, what's amazing about the guy that first settled there was he was a guide for Colonel Custer in the Army. And in the Sheep Eater War, which it wasn't a war, the Army came through and tried to chase him out. He saw that country for the first time, because he was a guide. and I think he packed ammunition too. But anyway, he came back once he was out of the military and settled there. But then there's been some others, that occupied that place, and now we have a landing strip. I can't remember. I think it's 2,600 feet long. Has a bit of a curve to it, so it's not an easy landing strip. It's one of the more difficult ones in the wilderness. But that was carved out with Jess Taylor and mules, and they call it a slip scoop, which is kind of a metal pan you drag behind. I mean, unbelievable work all by hand to straighten out and make flat a landing strip. And so, they started landing planes back in I think it was the 40s. So there's been a lot of time invested into it. And then the other thing, you can still see some signs of this is, so we have some nice big open meadows and pasture. And so for years, when we had stock in there, horses and mules, we would put up 14 ton of hay a year. But if you'd look out after it was mowed, or say early in the spring before the grasses started to grow, you'd see a series of spider web-like ditches. And what that was is those old timers would divert water from Pioneer Creek, and they had little trickle ditches that they would stop, and then the water would go down that one, and they'd stop that one, it would go down another. So they could cover quite a few acres and water it as they needed to spread out the water. And so those still remain. Now we have some hoses and some pivot sprinklers, which can help things green up. But then, for many, many years, we did everything. We had no electricity in there, and we did everything with stock. And the way we would do haying was you'd have to bring in, we'd call in all the researchers and students that had worked there or were in some project on the area, and usually near the 4th of July, they'd come in, and we'd have 12 to 16 people. And in the morning, hitch up the team and cut with a McCormick sickle bar mower. It was a 1948 sickle bar mower, and I was able to get parts for that clear up into the mid-1980s. And when we couldn't get parts anymore, we found one in Oregon at an old horse farm, and we took the wheels off because they're heavy, and we flew it in and we cannibalized it for other pieces. But you'd cut in the morning. You'd go over it with a dump rake, which is behind the mules. It was a rake that had tines that would go like this, and so you'd make windrows of hay. And then in the evening, you'd go flip it into piles about this high. And the next day, you'd hitch up a big wagon to the mules, and you'd go out, and you'd have a student with a pitchfork on either side of each mile. You'd go down, and they'd each go like this and just throw it up on the wagon. You'd have 3 people on the wagon stomping it in, and you had a number of students, and the horses would just weave through these hay miles so that everyone could throw it up. And we'd get, I can't remember, maybe up to 2 tons just on a wagon. No bales. We're just stacking it like a hay mile. And then eventually we built a pole barn to keep it out of the weather. We were losing too much, putting a piece of canvas over, and horses can't eat moldy hay. So eventually we built a pole barn, but it's all wood, and even with wood shakes and stuff, and we could put 14 to 16 ton in that. We did that for years, feed the stock, and then the stock were used to support the researchers. So they'd have spike camps, the people tracking mountain lion. You do that in the winter, and so they go out with permission from the Forest Service, and about 6 or 7 miles apart, they'd set up a big old canvas tent, cut some firewood, and then in the winter, they'd take somebody with mountain lion hunting dogs, and the researcher, they'd go out and track cougar, and they'd come across a track. The dogs would tree them, and then they'd dart them and do the radio call and things. So there's quite a history of people using it and using it with primitive skills. And we used to always cut all of our firewood with a crosscut saw, and students learned that you might run a chainsaw, but you pull a crosscut, and they'd they'd say, I can't do that. And by golly, they'd put up 3 or 4 cord just with a crosscut. So it's been quite a place.